with our second session. So moving from the broad outline we've had on productivity, growth and demographics for our second session, we're going to look at some of the medium and long-term implications in the health area. And we're delighted to have two excellent speakers in this area. And first up we have James Ebdon from the Office of Budgetary Responsibility in the UK, who will look at fiscal sustainability and public spending on health.
Thank you, Seamus. Thank you for inviting me along. It's been very interesting so far. I hope not to let the side down too much. So I'm from the OBR, so that's the Fiscal Council in the UK, and in a team where we deal with risk and sustainability of public finances. And part of that means that we do the long-term projections for the UK, where we look at as many aspects of the spending trends, revenue trends, the budget balance, and what that means for debt, which we heroically try to do over a 50-year horizon. And we do on the basis of current policy. Now, obviously, we've no real idea what current policy means over 50 years. So in practice, what this means in long-term fiscal modelling is you end up switching off a lot of the economy. We switch off fiscal drag. We uprate things in line with earnings and so on. Essentially what that means is we end up with a model that says, absent any other change in the world, if I just ran my model forward, I would end up with a sort of constant primary balance forever. And then what we do is we investigate, so what is going to change, and we put those through the model. We very much call these projections, not forecasts. I guess there's two main reasons for that. One of which is, as Professor Craft reminded us this morning, taking an average of the past is not necessarily the best way of predicting the future. Nevertheless, in order to populate a model, that's what I'm doing. And also, the model that we have is quite simplistic in that there's no real feedback from the fiscal position into the economic position. We end up assuming some long-run steady-state economic variables and working out fiscal from there, but then not fully closing that loop. The vast level of uncertainties inherent in this sort of modelling, I'm going to try and remember to stress throughout, mean that actually one of the most useful things that we can do here is look at the sensitivities in our model and try and find out what things matter in terms of the future. One of the other questions that was asked is whether winter's coming, winter's here. And one of the main things that we put through these sort of long-term models is demography. And I've had an ageing society for my entire life, and the sky hasn't fallen in. So one of the first questions is, actually, should we really be worried about this sort of thing? And the consensus is kind of yes. And I guess the reason is this is a way in which the past has not been like the future. This is all UK. In essence, for some reason I've lost dates off the bottom of this chart. I apologise. The first bar there is, get this right, 1957. No, 1967, 2017, and 2067 are the three sets of bars there. So what we've seen in the last 50 years, moving from the first bar to the second bar, is something of an expansion in the number of old people, offset by a reduction in the number of young people and a maintenance of the working population in the UK. Fiscally, as we'll see in a minute, what that means is that we've gained some expensive old people, but we've kind of offset that a bit by losing some slightly less expensive young people, but crucially we've maintained the working population who are paying for all this stuff. Looking forward though, the world's different. We continue to see, we expect sort of small declines in the number of young people, but the further increases in the number of old people are going to be much more rapid, and they come largely at the expense of the traditional working population. And actually, even this chart probably underestimates the world slightly, because really the bulk of this effect is happening now. The baby boom generation is passing out of the workforce, it's retiring, it's going to enter our top emergency red box there in the 2020s and so on. And it's that top oldest level of the population that at the moment at least are the most expensive people fiscally. So I think that we're in a world where, you know, ageing population hasn't really hit the UK yet, but it is now and it's going to in future. Little bit of international context, slightly random selection of countries. The UK in pink there. Internationally, we start from a relatively high old age dependency ratio, but our projected change in the next 50 years is actually quite a lot less than a number of countries, including Ireland. You start off lower than us, but by the end of 50 years, you've pretty much caught up there. And then you see, you know, certain undeveloped nations where the change is extraordinarily rapid. So how do we work out what demography means? Essentially, we have a model that underneath it sits a range of curves that show estimates of tax and spending. These are all broken down further by specific taxes, specific sort of functions of spending by age and by gender underneath these, but the age part is far more interesting. And in aggregate, what you end up with is something that's pretty intuitive. In terms of taxes, taxes are paid by people in their prime working age, but for the most part. Spending, there's a wodge of spending that goes on young people, partially through the benefit system, partly through health, but obviously education being the big thing there. And then as we get to retirement ages and beyond, spending per person increases rapidly, and this is pensions, this is social care, and this is health kicking in. And that increases essentially, you know, the older people get, the more expensive they get for us. I'm reminded at that point that I have a habit of speaking as if increases in longevity are a bad thing at this point. And I should remind myself to say, this is a good thing that we're all living longer, and these are just setting out the consequences of it. So we end up with, we've got demography, and we've got projections of that, in our case from our Office for National Statistics, going forward. We've got a snapshot of how spending and taxes work around about now, though some of our models are a bit out of date, but you know, we've got an idea of what now is, and what we need to do is to blend the two together and work out what happens in the future. And then we worry about the uncertainties there. As people have said, one of those uncertainties is around the demography. People have talked about it more than I will do, but you know, there are the three core assumptions that you need to make around these things: fertility, life expectancy, migration patterns. And the longer horizon you're looking at, the more and more these things matter. But actually, I would argue that in the sort of planning horizon that we can ever get any politician to sensibly look at, demography is probably not the world's biggest issue of uncertainty, because quite a lot of this is baked in. You know, those old people that we're going to have to look after in 10, 20 years are alive now, for the most part. And for the most part, they're living in the UK. What's more uncertain is the relationships between that demography and service provision. And this sits around a whole range of issues about how, you know, people retirement age will respond both to ageing and to state setting of pension ages. The key thing in health, which we're going to concentrate on here, concerns this issue of morbidity. And essentially there's a way in which you can say, look, it's not really ageing that's the issue here, it's ill health. And how much is ill health going to change with an ageing population? And the bad news there is that the international research into that has no answer. There's a range of estimates. From people saying that you should assume that for every year of increased life expectancy you get an increased year of old age, to people saying, the answer is 0, or it's more than 1. Or... Unfortunately, there are a range of possible answers to this. So, what you can do is pick something that's relatively within the spread there, and then show what the sensitivities to those assumptions are, and the degree to which that matters. But this is kind of a key worry in all of this. We should also say that not everything is demography. There are secular trends in other things. We particularly, there are secular trends in certain tax streams that you need to take into account. We have tremendously variable forecasts of what the returns from the North Sea oil are going to be, and what the effects of fuel efficiency is going to be, and things like that. The key one, though, in today, the overall biggest number and biggest assumption that sits in our model is what we do with cost pressures in health. It's again, unfortunately, it's been one of those things where there's a lot of international studies and a complete lack of consensus about numbers, but at least in this one we have an idea of a consensus of direction. Every international study that we've looked at, where it says that across a range of industrial countries, health spending is increasing faster than you would expect by merely looking at demography or price rises, whatever. There's something else going on in here. And we've decided in the UK that this is so prevalent across the world, and it's so obviously prevalent in the UK of the entire history of the National Health Service, that we should put in an estimate for this. I would stress the vast uncertainty over these numbers, but nevertheless we felt it was central to have a go. There's also quite a lot of literature about why spending increases faster in health than elsewhere. We've got a reasonable summary of some of the literature on our website, but I'll sprint through it, if I may. Different people kind of talk about the same sorts of things. They give very different weightings to these things, so it's a warning here. Part of this is about technological advances. Technology is weird in health. Most industries we would expect innovation to end up increasing quality, decreasing costs. Doesn't seem to work that way in health. We end up with some very expensive ways of treating conditions instead, of often conditions we couldn't treat in the past, but actually often more expensive ways of treating the same conditions that we've already got. So technology isn't on our side here. Relatively productivity growth, again, that's partly about the technology here, but it's also about the sort of labour-intensive nature of the health service. And, it's another one of those measurement things where measuring productivity in the health service is much more difficult, even than measuring productivity is in the whole economy. But nevertheless, I think people are fairly confident that productivity is lower. But it does raise, going back to Professor Craft's speak earlier, maybe he would like to think about earlier, there is an interesting question here about whether this is, about whether if we are in a potentially systemically low productivity world going forward, whether that means that the relative productivity gap for health closes and this becomes less of a problem for us. So in some ways, that may be the upside of low productivity in the future, or not, who knows. And the third thing that people talk about is spread of chronic conditions. Again, some of this is clearly about technology. It's about keeping people alive longer with expensive conditions which they require expensive new drugs for. Partly it's obviously there are lifestyle issues and other things going on in here as well. So in a UK context then, this is what this means. Typical of modelling, I've got a very chaotic past and a very smooth future. But essentially what you can see there is over a long period of time that the purple real health spending growth line is systemically above the yellow real GDP growth line. Though there have been periods, for instance in the 1980s, where that was reversed, and on occasions, since the austerity following the financial crisis, that's been the case. But nevertheless, on average, there's been this gap observed. We forecast that gap to increase over the medium term. That's the sort of lighter shaded part in all these graphs is our medium term forecast, where we're following what the government has laid out as its spending plans. And then the dark purple is when we really switch on our long-term model. So we expect, we have in our model that this gap between health spending growth and GDP growth widens over the medium term, and then attenuates somewhat over the next 50 years towards the magical number of 1% at the end, which we've scientifically chosen because that's the number that the CBO and the states have for the equivalent thing in their model. What does that mean in the UK context? It gives you this line here. Currently in the UK, health spending is a little over 7% of GDP. It's obviously state health spending. Well, whole company health spending is a little over 7% of GDP. Under these models, it essentially doubles to a little under 14% of GDP, which is the sort of number that causes us to wince somewhat in the fiscal world. As I said, what we need to do is look into the uncertainties a bit around that. I've got four other lines. Sorry, it's not wrong with my charts. I've got my lines here, right? So I'll tell you the four other lines. I've got a blue line and a yellow line there that's saying, okay, let's just change the assumption for this other cost pressures, put it up and down a bit. You know, I can reach a difference of up to like 3 or 4% of GDP by the end. Well, that's quite a lot. I've got a red line there that unfortunately didn't make the legend, where we've put through 3.4% real growth, which is the average historic growth in the NHS, which comes pretty close to where we are in our central number. And then the green line at the bottom is what would happen if there were no cost pressures, other cost pressures in here, and the government merely responded to demography by increasing, by allowing the expansion of healthcare to take care of an ageing population, but didn't, in essence, have any increases in provision beyond that. And that gives you about 2% rise. It's a very unrealistic line, I think, is what I would take from that. In a world of lower productivity growth in the health service and the rest of the economy, in practice, that green line of 2% growth means a reduction in the level of healthcare per capita, or for each age per capita over time, and that's very different from what the UK public has expected in the past, and it sounds very different from something that they're willing to accept in the future. So I think that very much represents a lower bound on plausible estimates, and actually I would put my money up in the middle somewhere. And this is all very interesting. One of the things that's difficult around this sort of long-term model, which I do appreciate, is it's pretty difficult to get any traction in the world over this sort of stuff. Even at the best of times, it's difficult to get politicians to look beyond a relatively short time frame. Clearly, this is not the best of times for them to be doing that. We're in a rather unique position of probably the uncertainties around my long-term model are less than the uncertainties around my very short-term model at the moment. But nevertheless, we can try and put these things in a little bit of context, and we can try and use them as a fiscal council to say useful things about things over a shorter time horizon. Last summer, the UK government gave National Health Service's 70th birthday present of what they billed as the largest settlement ever. It's a great thing. And one of the good things about this sort of long-term model is we can try and put that government settlement in context, and we can try and discuss it and its fiscal implications. So the yellow line there was what the government's old policy used to be, and the government's old policy used to be essentially to keep health spending flattish as a share of the economy. If we then switch on our long-term model, we would get the dotted line. We could say actually a sort of our neutral long-term assumption would be that that's the path that health spending should go. And the purple line is what the government actually did, and quite pleasingly in many ways it ends up close to our dotted line. So as a Fiscal Council, what does that allow us to do? It allows us to say two things, I think. One of which is that actually that health settlement was entirely wrong. That's exactly the sort of thing that we would expect an average government to do in an average circumstance based on history, pretty much. But secondly, from our view of looking at fiscal risks, really all the government's done is crystallise a risk that was already in there and hasn't really worsened the fiscal position really in the long run by doing this. Looking at time, thinking best hurry up, sorry. We run this through for a whole bunch of services. I won't go into any of these in detail, subject to say that spending rises from about 37 to 45% of GDP. An awful lot of that is in health, but we've got obviously other sections of spending where there are ageing pressures, and we've got a few sections where actually ageing is a good thing, such as education. But none of these things are as terrifying as the health number. We could do a similar chart on the tax side, but it looks really boring, and actually taxes stay relatively constant as a share of GDP. Primarily that's because if you go back to the beginning when we set up the model, we switched off a lot of the things that would vary the tax take as a percentage of GDP. But what we're talking here is the UK moving from spending somewhere in the mid-30s to somewhere in the mid-40s, which is a less terrifying way of looking at this chart, which is the sort of debt consequences of all of this. We've got a yellow line there which said, oh, what if we held our primary balance constant from the end of our medium-term forecast and our debt stock would gradually and slowly decline. But actually, if we start, if we open our primary balance by another 8-9 percentage points, we actually get to a position by the end of our forecast where we're running a primary deficit of about 8% of GDP. R minus G questions aside, we're also spending 12% of GDP on debt interest, so we're running in the 20-odd% deficits, and we've got an exponential curve upwards. Fortunately, there's no interaction with the economy, so none of this affects the world, which again, obviously a weakness in the thing. But essentially, this is what these models do. They give you an exponential curve, one way or the other. And we end up there in approaching 300% of GDP. Probably not realistic. People will do something in the interim. Sensitivities. This is one of the most useful things. We put through, our Office for National Statistics produces a range of variants around its central population models. We put them all through. You get a range of answers out at the end. The thing I take away from this is that actually the dispersion in up to about 2040 is not much. Were I planning health expenditure in the UK, I would just assume that this is given and not worry too much about demography in the next couple of decades. On the other hand, if I look at the cost pressure stuff, I end up at a much bigger dispersion at the end, but that kicks in immediately tomorrow. And this is where, if you're worried about the fiscal position, this is the thing that you should be worrying about. I don't have the morbidity chart in here. If I had morbidity, it would be somewhere between the two. So actually, morbidity is a medium-sized thing to worry about for the UK. I will summarise, if I may. Clearly, there is pressure from ageing and other health costs. Most industrial countries have this. I guess, you know, some countries, and this may be have the capacity to shift more of the risk of this onto the population and take less of it on. At a state level, the UK does not appear to have that option. For us, health is essentially 100% a government risk to bear, at least in terms of spending. There are lots of things, while we're looking at this stuff over a 50-year horizon, it's all very interesting and very academic. There's lots of actually very live policy things being debated within the UK and internationally that can have very material changes on the answer here. We've been stuck in consultation about how we do social care in the UK, I don't know, for a decade now, but popping round and round and round in circles, but essentially trying to face up to these questions. We seem to have done something about pensions uprating in terms of state pension ages, but we're locked in this appalling thing called the triple lock on pensions, which, if you know about it, which essentially means that we have an upward ratchet on pension costs over time, and most worrying of all, we have this health issue. The final bullet there is sort of rather daft in many ways. Something will need to be done about this. Thank you very much.